Tell us, which city are you watching from, and what time is it where you are right now? Let's see where our viewers around the world are tuning in from as we uncover the darkest corners of the past. They had counted the journey in waterskins and cartridges, not in conscience. 43 men moved in a staggered column across the hard, yellow earth, their boots and sandals pressing into a land that had learned to remember footprints. The year was late in the 19th century, in a season when the wind carried more dust than mercy. The hunters had left the safer edges of the trade corridor days earlier, following rumors that drifted between caravan routes like Ash, a small inland village, isolated by drought, lightly guarded, untouched by firearms. Easy labor, easy profit. Easy return. They were not an army, though they carried themselves like one. Some had once been soldiers for collapsing kingdoms. Some were debt collectors who had discovered that bodies could be counted as currency. Others were traders who had slowly turned from cloth and salt to flesh. Their rifles did not match, their dialects differed, their loyalties were thin, but they were unified by the arithmetic of captivity. 43 men meant enough force to overwhelm resistance, enough witnesses to silence each other. As doubts, enough muscle to drag dozens of captives back to the coast. Their leader, a broad-shouldered man named Kellen, had studied the map scratched into cured leather. He had bribed a passing caravan scout for details about wells and grazing fields. He had calculated distance by the rhythm of the sun and the ache in his knees. The village lay beyond a dry riverbed and 2 low ridges, hidden from the main track the caravans preferred. It was described as small, perhaps a few dozen huts. No mention of walls, no mention of guns. Only goats, Millie, and people. He told his men what they wanted to hear. They won't expect us this far inland, he said. The drought has made them desperate. Desperate people don't fight long. The men nodded because the sentence felt true. Drought hollowed strength. Hunger softened resistance. They'd seen it before. Villages reduced to bargaining with their children. Mothers trading bracelets for a day as delay. Fathers lowering their eyes. The hunters carried those memories like proof that the world obeyed predictable laws. Weakness yields, power takes. But the land did not always obey. 2 days before they reached the final ridge, the wind shifted. It came from the east, carrying the faint smell of smoke, and something else, wood oil perhaps, or the residue of cooking fires that burned regularly, not desperately. One of the younger hunters, a man called Ruffy, paused and sniffed the air. "They were not starving," he muttered. Kellen glanced back but did not slow. "Everyone cooks," he replied. "Smoke means nothing." Yet the colonel's rhythm altered almost imperceptibly. Men checked their powder. They adjusted the leather straps binding their rifles. The jokes that had filled the mornings faded into shorter exchanges. Something in the stillness ahead felt arranged, like a stage awaiting actors. On the final evening before contact, they camped behind a cluster of thorn trees. The ground there was trampled lightly, not by large herds, but by smaller, controlled movement. Someone had been careful about grazing. Someone had rotated animals to preserve grass. Kellen knelt and pressed his fingers into the soil. It was dry, yes, but not abandoned. He noticed small impressions, sandals, not boots, moving toward and away from the direction of the village. No frantic scuffing, no scatter. Order. "They think they're safe," one hunter said behind him. Kellen stood slowly. "That's good," he answered. "We move at dusk tomorrow. We watch from the ridge first." Night fell without incident. No scout from the village stumbled upon them. No warning horn echoed across the plains. The hunters interpreted silence as ignorance. They did not consider that silence could be intentional. At dawn, they climbed the first ridge. The village lay in the shallow basin beyond, exactly as described and yet not. From a distance, it seemed ordinary. Round huts of mud and thatch clustered around a central well. Thin smoke rose from 2 cooking fires. Goats wandered near a grazing patch to the west. A handful of figures moved slowly between huts. Rafi squinted. "Where are the men?" Kellen narrowed his eyes. He saw older figures, bent with age. He saw women carrying water jars. He saw children chasing each other near the well. "Probably in the fields," someone offered. But there were no visible fields beyond the immediate grazing area. No long lines of cultivation stretching into the horizon. No smoke from charcoal pits. No sign of expanded farmland that would require labor far from the huts. The hunters lay flat along the ridge and watched for hours. The pattern repeated, movement between huts, brief gathering at the well, goats herded lazily, then dispersal. No one looked toward the ridge. No one pointed. No one ran. It was a performance of normalcy so complete that it seemed to erase suspicion. By midday the men began to relax. "They don't know," one said. "They can't know," another agreed. Kellen allowed the thought to settle among them. He had raided villages that screamed at first sight of dust on the horizon. He had seen men flee before the first shot. This settlement showed none of that. Its calm felt almost insulting. He decided on a divided approach. 3 groups would descend from separate angles at nightfall. One would secure the well and central clearing. Another would circle west through the grazing patch to cut off escape. The third would approach from the east, driving villagers inward. Quick, efficient, minimal gunfire. Panic would do the rest. As the sun lowered, the hunters descended the ridge and spread into position, careful to remain beyond sight. They drank sparingly. They tightened straps. Kellen reviewed the plan twice. Timing mattered. Surprise mattered. What they did not see, hidden in the grass between huts and beyond the visible grazing line, were the careful alterations made to the land over months. Trenches no wider than a foot had been carved and covered with woven reeds dusted in soil. Clay jars filled with hornets had been buried beneath thin layers of earth near likely footpaths. The grazing patch, sparse though it appeared, had been seeded with sharpened stakes disguised as broken roots. Narrow lanes between huts had been subtly reshaped, guiding movement toward a central depression that had been hollowed deeper than it seemed. The village had not relied on strength, it had relied on study. At twilight, as shadows lengthened and the sky bled orange into purple, the western group began its descent toward the grazing field. They moved in a crouched line, rifles angled forward, boots pressing carefully into what looked like ordinary soil. The first collapse came without warning. The ground beneath the lead hunter gave way, and he vanished with a scream cut short by impact. The man behind him stumbled forward, instinctively reaching out, only to have the earth crack beneath him as well. 2 bodies disappeared into darkness, punctuated by the sickening sound of wood meeting flesh. Shouts erupted. The line fractured. Men leapt backward, only to land on unstable ground that shifted and dipped. The grazing patch was not a field. It was a net. Across the basin, dogs began barking not wildly but in a controlled rhythmic pattern. From the eastern approach, another group heard the commotion and accelerated their advance, believing the western men had simply engaged early. They did not see the slight rise in earth before them. When boots struck it, clay seals cracked. A low hum erupted, swelling into a violent buzz as hornets burst from hidden jars. Within seconds, the air filled with stinging bodies. Men dropped rifles to swat at their faces. One fired blindly, the shot echoing against the huts. Now the village changed. Figures that had moved slowly all day straightened. Women who had carried water jars set them down and lifted shields concealed behind walls. Older men disappeared into huts and emerged with spears. Children vanished entirely, as if swallowed by the earth. No one screamed. Instead, a low drumbeat began from somewhere within the huts. Steady, measured, not frantic. Kellen, advancing with the central group toward the well, heard both the scream from the west and the gunshot from the east. His instincts told him something had fractured beyond simple misstep. He signaled his men forward, intending to seize the well and force control before confusion spread. But as they entered the narrow lane between huts, they found it tighter than it had appeared from the ridge. Walls seemed to lean inward. The path curved subtly, limiting visibility. Shadows pooled in corners. A spear flew from above, striking the man at the front of the line. He fell without a sound. Another spear followed. Then stones. Not random throws, targeted, precise. Kellen raised his rifle and fired toward a rooftop silhouette, but the figure was already gone. The drumbeat intensified. From the grazing field, wounded men crawled from pits, dragging themselves through dirt slick with blood. From the eastern path, hornet-stung hunters staggered blindly, faces swelling, vision blurred. The 3 groups, meant to converge smoothly, were now separated by chaos engineered into the land itself. And still, the village did not rush outward. It held its perimeter. It allowed panic to ferment. Kellen felt it then, not fear exactly, but recognition. The calm they had observed all day had not been ignorance. It had been patience. He shouted for retreat to the ridge, but the sound of his voice was swallowed by the drums and the rising cries of his own men. Movement through the lanes funneled them inward rather than outward. The paths they thought led to open escape curved toward the central clearing. Above, the sky had darkened fully. Torches flared along the inner ring of huts, illuminating faces that no longer appeared old or weak. Warriors stepped forward, shields locked, spears angled. The hunters had come expecting collapse. Instead, they had triggered design. 43 men had entered the basin believing themselves predators. But as the first night unfolded and the land itself betrayed their assumptions, it became clear that they were no longer choosing the direction of movement. They were being guided. And somewhere beyond the torchlight, beyond the hollowed earth and hidden jars, the elders who had watched the horizon for weeks listened not to screams, but to confirmation that preparation had met opportunity. The trap had closed, and this was only the beginning. When dawn finally reached the basin, it did not reveal chaos in the way the hunters had expected. It revealed calculation. The smoke rising from the village fires that morning was steady, almost ceremonial. It did not carry the frantic scent of burning huts or scattered panic. Instead, it climbed in straight columns into the pale sky, as though the settlement had resumed its daily rhythm without interruption. But the ground told a different story. The grazing field was torn open in places where concealed pits had swallowed men. The narrow lanes between huts bore dark stains where bodies had fallen. Broken rifles lay half-buried in dust, their owners either dead, wounded, or dragged away. Of the 43 hunters who had descended with confidence the evening before, several were already beyond counting. Others lay groaning where they had crawled free from traps. A few, disoriented by hornet stings and darkness, had fled blindly toward the outer brush during the night and had not returned. Kellen had survived the first shock, though not untouched. A shallow cut ran along his shoulder where a spear had grazed him. He had gathered what remained of the central group during the final hours before dawn, retreating toward what he believed was the least fortified edge of the basin. But even retreat had been guided by terrain that seemed natural yet subtly shaped. The ground dipped and rose in misleading ways. What appeared to be open passage curved back toward the heart of the village. By first light, the hunters understood something that pride had prevented them from admitting the night before. They were not fighting a desperate settlement. They were inside a constructed defense system. The village had not chased them into the dark. It had not risked unnecessary casualties in reckless pursuit. Instead, it had allowed fear to ferment overnight. It had allowed the hunters to listen to the wounded, to count the missing, to feel the weight of unfamiliar vulnerability. And now, in daylight, the second phase began. Kellen crouched behind a low rise near the outer huts, counting heads. 31. That was what he could see or confirm. 12 unaccounted for, some surely dead in pits, others perhaps captured. The number pressed into him with humiliating clarity. 43 had felt invincible. 31 felt exposed. Regroup, he ordered, voice lower now, stripped of the earlier certainty. We push west, out through the grazing line. A murmur of hesitation followed. The grazing line had already proven treacherous, but staying meant encirclement. They moved cautiously, probing the ground with rifle butts before stepping. The sun climbed higher, heat intensifying the metallic scent in the air. The village remained eerily composed. Women moved between huts again. An old man sat near the well, as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. But now the hunters saw details they had missed before. The old man held his staff too firmly, posture too straight. The women's movements were efficient, eyes alert. No children played near the well this morning. As the western group approached what remained of the grazing patch, a low horn sounded from somewhere beyond sight. Not frantic measured, a signal. From behind the outer huts, a line of warriors emerged, shields interlocked. They did not charge. They advanced slowly, forcing the hunters' movement toward the very ground they feared. Fire! Kellen shouted. Gunshots cracked through the basin. One warrior fell. The shield line tightened, closing the gap. Arrows answered from rooftops and concealed perches along the basin walls. One hunter dropped with a shaft lodged in his thigh. Another fell clutching his throat. The hunters fired again, but gunfire required clarity, and clarity was being eroded by design. The shield wall absorbed what it could. The rest of the village remained disciplined, advancing only when advantage was certain. Then the ground shifted again. A hunter to Kellen's left stepped where the earth appeared firm. It collapsed, revealing another concealed trench, narrow, not deep enough to kill outright, but sufficient to twist ankles and break formation. The line fractured. Men stumbled into one another. The warriors did not rush immediately. They allowed the disarray to widen. From the eastern side of the basin, another drumbeat began, echoing across the hard earth. The rhythm differed from the night before, faster, urgent, designed to unsettle. Kellen realized the pattern. The village was not improvising. It was executing phases. The hunters attempted to pull back toward the ridge they had descended, but new figures had appeared, their warriors positioned along the slope, cutting off the cleanest exit. They had been there since before dawn, unseen in shadow. The realization settled heavily. The hunters were no longer raiders. They were contained. By midday, the temperature became an additional enemy. Wounded men weakened under the sun. Water skins were nearly empty. The well stood visible in the center of the village, tantalizing and unreachable. Kellen made a decision born of desperation rather than strategy. "We push for the well," he said. "Break the center. Take water. They'll fall back." It was the kind of move that had succeeded in other villages, where panic replaced planning once the center was threatened. But as they advanced through the curved lanes again, the architecture betrayed them. Paths narrowed further than before, as though walls had shifted overnight. In reality, woven barriers had been repositioned silently during darkness, reshaping corridors. The hunters emerged into the central clearing only to find the ground uneven. The depression there subtle when first observed from the ridge was deeper than expected. As the men rushed forward, their footing faltered. That was when the second shield wall closed behind them. They were inside the hollow. Spears rained from the rim. Arrows asked downward. Hunters fired upward, but elevation favored defenders. Smoke from torches thrown into the depression thickened the air, blurring sight. One by one, rifles emptied. Powder ran low. Kellen felt the battle tipping irreversibly. He had led men into ambushes before, but never into one so patiently crafted. This village had anticipated division, panic, retreat, and aggression. It had allowed them to believe each option was their own choice. By late afternoon, resistance fractured. Several hunters threw down weapons. Others collapsed from wounds or exhaustion. A handful attempted a final rush toward the western slope and were intercepted by a coordinated flank that had remained hidden until that precise moment. Silence fell gradually, not abruptly. The drums ceased first, then the shouting. Only the wind remained, carrying dust across a basin that had been transformed into a lesson. 31 had begun the morning. By sunset, fewer than half remained standing. Some were bound, some lay still. A few had managed to flee into the brush during the confusion, but their numbers were small and their direction uncertain. The villagers moved with controlled efficiency. Wounded hunters were disarmed and tied. The dead were dragged to the outer edge of the basin. Weapons were collected, examined, and stacked. The well was guarded carefully, water distributed first to their own injured. No one celebrated loudly, no wild triumph echoed. Instead, elders gathered in the central clearing as dusk approached. The captured hunters were forced to kneel along the rim of the hollow that had trapped them. Faces swollen from stings, clothes torn, eyes hollowed by disbelief, they looked less like predators now and more like men stripped of narrative. An elder stepped forward, staff in hand. His voice was calm but carried across the basin. "You came for our children," he said. "You came because you believed we were weak." He gestured toward the pits in the grazing field, toward the reshaped lanes, toward the warriors standing silent behind shields. "We watched the horizon for years. We buried those taken before. We learned." The words were not shouted. They were recorded in memory. Kellen met the elder's gaze. For the first time since descending from the ridge, he understood the scale of miscalculation. This had not been spontaneous retaliation. It had been generational preparation. Night approached again, but this time the hunters were the ones contained, bound within a village they had intended to dismantle. And beyond the basin, across the wider region, other settlements waited, watching for signals, listening for drum patterns carried by wind. The trap village had not merely defended itself. It had demonstrated a method, and the story of 43 hunters would not end in this basin alone. It would travel, reshaping routes, altering calculations, rewriting assumptions. The second day had confirmed what the first night had suggested. The hunters had misread the silence, and now they would pay for it. By the third morning, the basin no longer resembled a battlefield. It resembled a tribunal. The surviving hunters, those not killed in pits, pierced by arrows, or lost in blind flight, were bound with fiber cord and seated in a long row facing the central clearing. Their wrists were tied, but not cruelly. Their weapons had been dismantled and stacked behind the shield line. The broken rifles lay in pieces, metal separated from wood, powder scattered deliberately into the dirt. The message was unmistakable. Tools of dominance had been reduced to scraps. The sun rose slowly, heat gathering in layers. No one rushed the proceedings. The village operated as it always had in daylight, water drawn from the well, goats led carefully along safe corridors, food prepared in measured quantities. Yet, beneath that ordinary rhythm, intention sharpened. Kellan sat among the captives, his shoulders stiff, his pride fractured more deeply than the wound. He counted faces again. 19. Out of 43, 24 gone, dead, missing, or scattered into wilderness without supplies. The arithmetic pressed against his ribs like a stone. He had built his authority on certainty, on the assumption that fear flowed one direction. Now he faced a community that had reversed the current. The elders gathered beneath the shade of a wide acacia near the well. They did not stand elevated. They did not wear armor. Authority rested in composure. The eldest among them, a man with silvered hair and a carved staff, studied the captives without visible anger. "We will speak," he said quietly, though his voice carried. A translator stepped toward one of the younger villagers who had traded along outer routes and understood multiple tongues. The hunters listened as the elder's words were repeated in language they could not pretend to misunderstand. "You entered our land with intent to take. You divided your force, believing us unaware. You saw smoke and thought it meant weakness. You saw children and thought it meant vulnerability. You did not ask who dug the wells. You did not ask who mapped the ground beneath your boots." The translator's cadence was steady, almost clinical. The elder continued, "Years ago others came. Fewer than you, we did not know their methods. We did not prepare. We buried our sons and daughters. We buried elders who could not run. We learned from that burial." A murmur moved through the villagers, not rage, but remembrance. Kellan felt something unfamiliar, the weight of narrative shifting away from him. He had always defined raids in terms of opportunity and supply. Now he was being defined as part of a pattern the village had studied. "You counted 43, the elder said. "We counted years." The phrase lingered. Behind the captives, several warriors began to display what had been hidden before the raid. Woven mats pulled back to reveal trenches, clay jar fragments laid out to show how hornets had been contained, diagrams scratched into dirt demonstrating how lanes had been reshaped over months to funnel intruders. This was instruction. The village was not merely punishing. It was documenting. The hunters watched as the system was explained, how children had been relocated weeks prior when scouts first reported dust on the horizon, how elders had timed smoke patterns to suggest routine, how grazing had been rotated not only for sustainability but to conceal pit placements. Kellan understood now why the calm from the ridge had felt unsettling. It had not been ignorance. It had been rehearsal perfected. One of the younger hunters broke silence. "Kill us," he spat, voice hoarse, "or trade us." The translator relayed the words. The elder's expression did not change. "Death is simple," he replied. "Trade is temporary. Message is lasting." A pause followed, heavy with implication. The village leader rose, then a woman whose presence had been subtle until now. She stepped forward with a staff carved differently from the elder's, marked with notches along its length. "These," she said, gesturing to the notches, "are those taken before you came. Each mark is a name." She moved down the line of captives slowly. "You are not the first to walk here believing the ground would hold you." The hunters lowered their eyes, not from submission but from the dawning recognition that they had misjudged not only strength but memory. As midday approached, the proceedings shifted. The captives were separated into smaller groups, not randomly, intentionally. Those identified as leaders or experienced raiders were placed apart from younger recruits. The village had interrogated them during the night, quietly extracting information about routes, contacts, patterns of movement. They now knew where caravans intersected, where coastal brokers operated, where previous raids had originated. Intelligence replaced vengeance as the primary currency. Kellan was brought before the elders separately. His wrists remained bound, but he was allowed to stand. "You planned the division," the elder stated. "Yes," Kellan answered, refusing to feign ignorance. "You believed 3 directions meant confusion for us." "Yes," the elder nodded once. "It meant confirmation." The translator did not need to embellish. Kellan swallowed. "What do you want?" The woman leader answered this time. "We want the route you use when you return. We want the name of the broker who buys what you steal. We want to know how many others count as you counted." Silence stretched. Kellan weighed resistance against inevitability. He could refuse, but refusal no longer guaranteed dominance. It guaranteed irrelevance. He spoke. Over the next hour, he described the trade corridor, the coastal intermediary who paid in salt and coin, the seasonal patterns of movement. Each detail was repeated aloud by the translator and etched into dirt by a young villager who recorded with careful precision. The trap village was expanding its map. By late afternoon, a decision was announced. Some of the captured hunters would not leave. Those whose hands were most directly stained, identified through interrogation and admission, would face permanent judgment within the village. The rest would be released. A ripple of disbelief passed through the captives. Released? The elder clarified, "You will leave without weapons, without powder, without supplies. You will carry what happened here in your memory and in your mouths. You will speak of pits and hornets and hollow ground. You will speak of drums. You will speak of counting years." The strategy crystallized. Fear travels faster than caravans. If 19 men staggered back to the trade corridor with identical testimony, the story would spread. Routes would shift. Calculations would change. Other villages listening for rumor would learn. As the sun began its descent, the warriors moved with renewed purpose. The broken rifles were piled high and set aflame. Powder hissed uselessly in the fire. Metal warped in heat. The captives chosen for release were untied, one by one, but their wrists bore the mark of ash, smeared deliberately across skin, a sign that they had been inside the basin and survived by mercy, not strength. Kellen felt the ash pressed against his forehead, cool at first, then drying in the heat. "You will walk," the woman leader said. "You will not be followed. If you return with weapons, the ground will remember you." The 19 were escorted beyond the ridge at dusk. No arrows flew. No spears followed. The village did not need to chase. From the ridge, Kellen looked back once. The basin appeared ordinary again, smoke rising, goats grazing in controlled arcs, huts arranged in humble symmetry. Nothing about it suggested the architecture of entrapment that had consumed 43 men, but Kellen knew. The land beneath that calm surface had been altered irrevocably. As the released hunters began their long, thirsty march toward the outer corridor, silence accompanied them. No one boasted. No one argued. Each step carried the weight of reversal. Behind them, in the village, preparations continued not for celebration but for communication. Runners would depart at dawn to neighboring settlements, carrying detailed accounts of trap design and tactical sequencing. Diagrams would be replicated. Drum codes would be shared. The trap had not been an isolated defense. It was the first demonstration of a network awakening. And as night fell over the plains, the story of 43 hunters who had walked confidently into a basin and walked out broken began its journey outward, reshaping the horizon long before the men themselves reached it. The 19 men who left the basin walked through the night without speaking. The ash marks on their foreheads had dried into gray streaks, visible even in moonlight. They had been given no water skins, no provisions, no weapons, only direction. West, toward the outer corridor. West, toward the trade route that had once felt like a lifeline. Behind them, the village did not sleep. The fourth phase had already begun. Before dawn, runners departed in 4 directions, each carrying memorized instruction rather than written messages. They moved light and fast, barefoot across terrain they knew intimately. Their task was not to celebrate victory, it was to replicate it. By sunrise, 3 neighboring settlements would know about the grazing field pits, the hornet jars, the reshaped lanes, the hollowed clearing. They would know the timing of drum signals and the discipline required to maintain calm under observation. They would know that the illusion of weakness was more powerful than visible fortification. The trap was no longer a single event. It was doctrine. Within the basin, the remaining captives, those not released, were brought before the elders once more. These were men identified as repeat raiders, individuals who had participated in previous abductions, confirmed by markings, testimonies, and their own admissions. The village did not rush judgment, but neither did it postpone it indefinitely. The decision was delivered without spectacle. Those men would remain, not as prisoners to be traded, not as labor to be exploited. They would be used to rebuild what earlier raids had damaged. Terraces reinforced, wells deepened, defensive trenches expanded. They would work under watch, not in chains of cruelty, but in a system of visible consequence. Justice in this basin was strategic. Meanwhile, the 19 survivors staggered toward the corridor. The journey stripped them further. Without supplies, they were forced to ration what little strength remained. 2 collapsed by the second day and were left behind with no ceremony. The rest pressed forward, driven less by hope than by the need to escape the memory of structured defeat. When they finally reached the outer trade route, they did not arrive as a triumphant band returning with captives. They arrived as fragmented witnesses. Caravan guards saw them first, dirty, sunburned, hollow-eyed. Word spread quickly. Questions followed immediately. What happened? Where are the others? Where are the captives? The answers came slowly at first, then all at once. Pits hidden beneath grazing fields. Hornets released from buried jars, lanes that curved like traps, drums that controlled movement. A hollowed center that swallowed armed men. The story spread along the corridor faster than disbelief could contain it. At a trading post 2 days west, a broker who had financed the expedition listened as Kellen recounted the sequence in clipped detail. The broker expected excuses. Instead, he heard precision engineering coordination preparation measured in years. "You are saying peasants outplanned you," the broker muttered. Kellen did not rise to the insult. "I am saying they were waiting." That word altered the air. Waiting implied foresight. Waiting implied intelligence networks. Waiting implied that future raids might encounter similar resistance. Within a week, the trade corridor buzzed with versions of the same account. Some exaggerated the number of warriors, others insisted the village possessed foreign firearms. But the consistent details, the pits, the hornets, the drums remained intact. And fear, once monopolized by raiders, began to reverse direction. Back in the basin, reconstruction accelerated. The trenches were reinforced. Additional hollow zones were dug beyond visible boundaries. Watch posts were positioned along distant ridges, manned in rotating shifts. Children returned gradually from hidden safe locations, instructed carefully in the art of observation. The elders convened nightly, reviewing reports from neighboring villages. Already, 2 settlements had begun digging their own concealed defenses. Another had adopted the drum code system, modifying it to fit local terrain. What had begun as survival had become strategy shared. The woman leader walked the perimeter at dusk, examining improvements personally. She paused at the grazing field where the first collapse had occurred. The pits that had been widened slightly, not to kill, but to immobilize. The goal was no longer merely deterrence. It was capture for intelligence extraction. War, she understood, was evolving. 3 weeks after the failed raid, a scout returned from the outer ridge with news. Caravans were bypassing the region entirely. The main corridor had shifted 10 miles south, closer to a river crossing believed safer. The shift had economic consequences. Traders who relied on traffic near the basin found fewer customers, but the elders had anticipated this. Alternative exchange points were being negotiated quietly with inland partners. Salt and grain could still move without vulnerability. The transformation was not purely defensive, it was structural. Elsewhere along the corridor, rival raider groups debated openly whether the basin's story was myth or warning. Some dismissed it as exaggeration born from wounded pride. Others, more pragmatic, adjusted their routes, avoiding settlements that displayed subtle signs of preparation, grazing fields too orderly, smoke patterns too consistent, paths too narrow. The trap village. Its greatest victory was not the defeat of 43 men. It was the doubt implanted in hundreds more. Within 2 months, intelligence networks had formed among clusters of villages, signals mirrors by day, coded drums by night linked settlements across surprising distances. A raider sighted near one horizon could be anticipated by another before dust even appeared. Kellen, meanwhile, found himself marginalized. His credibility had eroded. Investors preferred leaders who promised success, not cautionary tales. Yet some younger men sought him out privately, demanding details. "Is it true they let you go?" one asked. "Yes. Why?" "So we would speak." The young man frowned. "Then we shouldn't." Kellen's answer came without hesitation. "You already are." Silence followed. The story could not be suppressed. Too many had seen the ash marks. Too many had counted the missing. Back in the basin, the elders gathered one evening beneath a sky washed violet by approaching rain. The air smelled different now, charged, fertile. The woman leader addressed the council. "They will adapt," she said. "Others will test us. Some will come in larger numbers. Some will try fire instead of stealth." The elder with the silvered hair nodded. "Then we adapt again." Preparation became continuous. Children learned terrain mapping as part of daily chores. Hunters who once tracked antelope now tracked human movement patterns. The memory of loss was not allowed to fade into complacency. It was maintained as fuel. One afternoon, a runner arrived breathless from a northern settlement. A small raiding party, 8 men, had approached that village cautiously, probing for weakness. They had turned back before committing. They heard the drums. The runner reported. The basin elders exchanged glances. The doctrine was working. By the end of the season, the region's map looked different. Not physically, but psychologically. Raiders avoided areas rumored to be engineered. Brokers recalculated risk premiums. Caravans chose longer but perceived safer paths. The trap village had altered the economy of fear, and yet vigilance did not wane. On a quiet evening, as children, laughter returned cautiously to the clearing. The woman leader stood at the edge of the hollow where the hunters had once been contained. The depression remained, now reinforced and disguised anew. She understood something essential. Victory was not a single event, but a maintained condition. 43 had come believing they controlled the narrative of power. 19 had walked away carrying a different one. And across the plains, under the same relentless sun that had once favored the armed and the ruthless, a new equation had begun to settle into the soil. Preparation multiplied by unity could outweigh numbers. The basin was no longer merely a village. It was a signal fire, quiet, deliberate, and visible to anyone who cared to read the horizon correctly. By the time the dry season began to loosen its grip, the basin had become something more than a fortified settlement. It had become a reference point. Travelers who passed within sight of the ridges did so carefully now, scanning the horizon not for weakness, but for signs of deliberate design. The grazing fields remained sparse, almost deceptively modest. Smoke rose in predictable patterns each morning and evening. Goats grazed along arcs that seemed casual but were in fact carefully controlled to conceal reinforced trenches beneath certain corridors. Nothing about the village appeared aggressive. That was the point. The fifth phase was not about immediate conflict. It was about deterrence layered over readiness. News continued to circulate along the trade corridor. Of the 43 who had marched confidently inland, only 17 were confirmed alive weeks later. 2 more had succumbed to wounds during the return. The rest were presumed dead or absorbed into labor within the basin. The number itself shifted in retellings, but the outcome did not. A raiding party had been dismantled by Tyrone and planning rather than superior firepower. For brokers who financed such expeditions, this represented a dangerous precedent. If one village could engineer defeat, others might follow. The cost-benefit calculation, once skewed heavily in favor of armed raiders, began to wobble. In response, a new proposal emerged along the southern corridor, a larger, more coordinated expedition. Not 43 men, but perhaps 60, with fire as a primary tool. Burn huts, collapse wells, deny defensive advantage, overwhelm through volume. Whispers of this plan reached the basin through its expanding network. A northern settlement reported unusual gatherings near a river crossing. A trader, sympathetic to inland communities, passed a long overheard conversation about correcting the insult. The elders convened immediately. Inside the central clearing, beneath woven shade, the woman leader addressed the assembly. "They will not repeat the same mistake," she said. "They will not divide so easily. They will come heavier." The silver-haired elder tapped his staff against the ground once. "Then we will not repeat ourselves either." Preparation shifted accordingly. The hollow in the center of the village was expanded subtly, its perimeter strengthened with concealed reinforcement to prevent collapse under fire. Secondary pits were dug beyond the visible grazing line, farther out than before, designed not to kill but to slow large formation. Water storage was diversified. Hidden reserves were placed beyond the main well in case of targeted sabotage. Perhaps most importantly, evacuation protocols were refined. Children and elders had been relocated weeks before the first raid. Now, layered contingencies ensured that even if flames reached the outer huts, life would remain protected. The basin was preparing not merely to trap but to absorb shock. Weeks passed with tense quiet. Scouts rotated along distant ridges, using mirrored flashes during daylight to communicate movement. At night, drum codes pulsed across distances, linking villages in a web of awareness. Then, one afternoon, a plume of dust appeared on the southern horizon. The signal came in 3 mirror flashes, spaced deliberately. Not a caravan. Not livestock. Armed movement. The basin did not erupt into panic. There were no shouted orders, no frantic running. Instead, rehearsed roles activated silently. Children and elders were guided along concealed exit paths toward a secondary settlement deeper inland. Water jars were redistributed. Warriors took positions along outer rings. From the ridge, Scouts counted the approaching force. 50, heavier than before, denser formation. Several carried torches even in daylight, a sign of intention. The Southern raiders halted briefly at a distance, observing the basin as Kellen's group once had. They had heard the stories. They saw the same smoke patterns, the same goats, the same modest huts. But they also saw something else. The village did not appear to fortify in response. No visible walls. No raised barricades. One of the raider leaders laughed. "Stories grow teeth when men lose," he said. They advanced. Unlike the first group, they did not divide immediately. They approached in a wide line, attempting to reduce vulnerability to concealed traps. They probed the ground cautiously, sending 2 men forward at intervals to test soil. The first pit did not activate. That was intentional. The basin had altered timing. Only when the front line moved deeper, committed beyond easy retreat, did the secondary traps trigger. Not directly beneath the vanguard, but beneath the center mass. A segment of earth collapsed, swallowing 6 men in a chain reaction. The formation fractured, but this group did not panic as easily. Leaders barked orders. Torches were flung toward huts, igniting thatch at the perimeter. Flames climbed quickly. This was the adaptation the elders had anticipated. Instead of rushing to extinguish the fire, villagers withdrew inward, allowing outer structures, preselected and partially emptied, to burn. The fire served as distraction while concealed flank units moved along trenches outside the raiders. Immediate awareness. Then the drums began again. Not the steady rhythm of the first engagement. This time, staggered pulses echoed from 3 distant ridges, suggesting numbers larger than present. The sound traveled unnaturally across dry air, amplified by terrain. The raiders hesitated. Arrows descended from angles they had not anticipated. The basin's defenders did not form a single shield wall this time. They operated in rotating clusters, striking and retreating behind reinforced positions. Smoke thickened, obscuring sight lines for gunfire. Raiders fired into shifting silhouettes, wasting powder. Meanwhile, several found their footing, betrayed by concealed trenches placed specifically to disrupt dense formation. The battle stretched longer than the first encounter. This was not a swift collapse, but an endurance test. As dusk approached, the raiders' torches became liabilities. Light revealed the positions while defenders blended with darkened terrain they knew intimately. When the central hollow was triggered deliberately, its perimeter collapsing inward as raiders surged too far, the same containment principle re-emerged. But this time, it captured not a divided party but the core of a heavier force. Panic finally pierced discipline. The sound of retreat calls echoed unevenly. Some raiders fled southward, abandoning wounded. Others attempted to regroup and were intercepted by outer flank units that had remained concealed until that precise moment. By nightfall, the second expedition had fractured. Not annihilated entirely, but broken. Several escaped under cover of darkness. Many did not. The basin suffered damage, outer huts burned, a handful of defenders wounded, but its core remained intact. Water reserves preserved, children safe beyond the ridges. As dawn revealed smoke curling from charred thatch, the village did not celebrate, it rebuilt. The lesson from the first 43 had matured. Adaptation had met adaptation. Within days, word of the failed southern expedition traveled along the corridor. The number 58 entered Roma beside 43. Investors withdrew quietly. Routes shifted further away. Some brokers began seeking alternative commodities, reconsidering the viability of inland raids altogether. The trap village had survived not just once, but twice. And more importantly, it had demonstrated that escalation would not guarantee dominance. Preparation could scale. Unity could absorb force. The basin, scarred but unbroken, stood as evidence. The 5th phase had proven something critical. Deterrence, once established and defended, becomes exponential. And across the widening plains, under a sky that watched without judgment, the calculus of those who hunted human lives continued to erode one engineered defeat at a time. The second failed expedition did more than wound pride along the southern corridor, it fractured confidence. In the weeks that followed, Basin did not experience immediate retaliation. Instead, it experienced something more subtle and, in some ways, more dangerous: calculation. The brokers who financed raids were not sentimental men. They were investors. Losses of 43 had been troubling. Losses approaching 60 were catastrophic. Powder cost money. Weapons cost money. Men cost money. And now, the return on investment had collapsed into ash and rumor. But when brute force fails, strategy shifts. Intelligence began flowing in the opposite direction. Scouts not associated openly with raiding parties began appearing along distant ridges, observers rather than attackers. Traders who had once moved casually between settlements now asked more questions than they answered. A man might purchase grain and linger longer than necessary, mapping paths with his eyes. Another might offer salt at an unusually generous rate, seeking trust. The basin noticed. The sixth phase would not be about open confrontation. It would be about infiltration. One afternoon, a young scout named Loma returned from the northern perimeter with a quiet report. 3 unfamiliar men had approached a neighboring village posing as cloth traders. They carried no obvious weapons. They paid fairly. They asked polite questions. Too polite. What questions? The woman leader asked. How many families here? How far to the nearest water source? Has anyone passed through recently with guns? The pattern was clear. The corridor was probing weaknesses indirectly. The elders convened at dusk. The silver-haired elder traced a line in the dirt, representing the corridor, southern shift, then another indicating the northern approach. They will not attack the basin directly again, he said. Not yet. They will look for softer ground. The woman leader nodded. Then we do not wait for softer ground to fall. The net were activated. Runners moved at first light, not only to warn but to coordinate deception. If scouts were gathering data, that data would be manipulated. In the northern settlement where the cloth traders had visited, elders agreed to present a narrative of vulnerability. They exaggerated internal disputes. They complained openly about poor harvests. They suggested that defensive efforts had drained resources. Meanwhile, beneath that staged fragility, trenches were being dug. The basin shared its knowledge methodically. Not every village adopted identical trap designs. Terrain varied too widely, but the principles remained constant. Shape the ground, control perception, synchronize signals. Weeks passed. The cloth traders returned to the northern settlement, this time accompanied by 2 additional men who lingered at the outskirts, studying livestock movement. They observed no visible fortification. They noted thin livestock numbers and heard repeated complaints about hardship. Their report traveled southward along quiet channels. Opportunity, they concluded, had resurfaced. The raiding party assembled for the northern approach was smaller than previous attempts, 26 men. Caution had replaced arrogance. They intended a quick strike, seize what they could, retreat before resistance consolidated. But the northern settlement was no longer isolated. 2 days before the raiders arrived, mirror signals flashed from ridge to ridge. The basin received confirmation and began subtle repositioning. A detachment of 15 warriors moved north under cover of darkness, avoiding visible trails. They would not defend the basin this time. They would reinforce the network. When the 26 raiders approached the northern village, they found what appeared to be disorganization. Huts were spaced loosely. Livestock were poorly contained. A few men argued near the well. The raiders advanced confidently. They encountered no pits at the grazing edge. They smiled. The first phase of defense was absence. They moved deeper, crossing the threshold between huts. Then the signal came not from within the northern village, but from the ridge behind them. A drumbeat measured, identical to the basin, as original code. The raiders turned. From the slope they had descended, warriors emerged, those who had marched silently from the basin 2 nights prior. At the same time, the northern villagers dropped their performance of disorder. Shields appeared from behind walls. Spears rose from beneath mats. The raiders found themselves bracketed. This was not a hollow trap like the basin, a central depression. It was a corridor trap, 2 settlements acting as jaws. The 26 attempted retreat toward open plains, but concealed trenches along that exit disrupted their formation. They fired desperately, but their lines of sight were compromised by smoke, deliberately lit in crosswind patterns. The battle was shorter than previous engagements. Surprise had shifted sides again. By sunset, the raiding party had collapsed. A handful fled into brush. The majority were captured or killed. The northern settlement had not simply defended itself, it had executed a coordinated counter-ambush. Word of the event spread more quickly than before because it contained a new element, cooperation across distance. The basin was no longer perceived as a single dangerous anomaly. It was the visible center of a region that communicated. Along the corridor, anxiety hardened into avoidance. Routes shifted farther still. Investors began calculating alternative enterprises, livestock, minerals, transport, anything less volatile than human capture. But the sixth phase did not allow complacency. The elders in the basin understood that pressure might now turn inward in different ways. If direct raids became unprofitable, sabotage or internal division could be attempted. One evening, a man arrived at the basin claiming to be a displaced farmer from the southern edge of the corridor. He spoke of burned crops and lost family. He asked for shelter. The village did not reject him, but it did not absorb him blindly. For 3 days he was housed separately, observed discreetly. His story was cross-checked through the network. No corresponding reports of burned farmland existed. On the 4th day, confronted gently but directly, the man's narrative unraveled. He admitted he had been paid to map defensive features, nothing more. The woman leader did not order execution. Instead, she brought him to the edge of the central hollow and explained what had happened to those who came with weapons. "You were sent because they cannot win in daylight," she said. "They hoped you would open a door." He was escorted beyond the ridge and released with a message identical in tone to that delivered months before. Return with truth, not to deception. The basin chose again to weaponize narrative over blood. As the dry season deepened toward its harshest weeks, the plains grew quieter than they had in years. Fewer dust plumes appeared on distant horizons. Fewer scouts lingered at the edges of settlements. But quiet was not misread as safety. Children continued to learn drum codes. Trenches were maintained and disguised anew. Mirror signals were practiced even when no threat loomed. The sixth phase had revealed something critical. Resistance could not remain reactive. It had to anticipate evolution. The hunters had begun as predators expecting compliance. They had shifted to heavier force, then to infiltration. Each time, the basin and its allies had adapted, not merely surviving, but strengthening the network. By the end of the season, a transformation had taken root beyond immediate battles. Communities once isolated by distance now shared intelligence routinely. Suspicion of unfamiliar visitors sharpened. Trade adapted to safer channels. The economy of capture was shrinking, not eliminated but constrained. And in the basin, beneath a sky unbroken by smoke for many weeks, the woman leader stood once more at the ridge at dusk. She watched the horizon not with fear, but with awareness sharpened by repetition. 43 had come first, then 58, then 26. Each number had tested resolve. Each number had strengthened coordination. The sixth phase had proven that defense was no longer localized. It was regional. And somewhere along the corridor, men who once believed numbers alone guaranteed dominance began to understand a different equation, one that did not favor aggression when preparation and unity stood ready to receive it. The seventh phase began without smoke. That was what unsettled them most. For nearly 2 seasons, resistance had been visible: traps, trenches, coordinated ambushes, captured raiders released with warnings. Conflict had shape. It had edges. Now the edges dissolved. The corridor did not send a large force. It did not send traders. It did not send infiltrators pretending to be farmers. Instead, it sent silence. Caravans that once cut across the plains with predictable routes altered course so drastically that some bypassed entire regions. Settlements that had relied on intercepting those caravans felt the economic pressure first. Markets thinned. Supply lines shifted eastward. The flow of gunpowder and ammunition reduced not from morality, but from cost-benefit recalculation. The basin watched the shift with careful attention. At first, elders wondered if deterrence had succeeded beyond expectation. But the woman leader remained cautious. When a predator withdraws, it is either wounded or hunting differently. Reports began arriving from far, beyond the original corridor. Not raids, not scouting. Purchases. A broker in a distant town was buying land near a narrow pass that connected 3 interior valleys. Another investor acquired water rights along a tributary used by migrating herds. Elsewhere, a small fortified trading post was constructed at a crossroads previously considered neutral territory. The pattern emerged slowly. If force could not penetrate the basin and its growing alliance, then the strategy would target movement. Control the routes. Control the water. Control the trade. The elders gathered beneath the central acacia. A map scratched into hardened earth showed the widening web of settlements now communicating regularly. The silver-haired elder traced a new circle beyond their perimeter. "They are building gates," he said quietly. "Not gates of wood or iron. Gates of dependency. If caravans were forced through controlled passes, tolls could be extracted. If water sources were monopolized, livestock migration could be manipulated. If neutral crossroads became fortified outposts, information flow could be filtered. It was war by infrastructure. The Basin faced a decision unlike any before. Trenches and ambushes could repel bodies. They could not repel economics. The woman leader spoke carefully. We learned to shape the ground beneath our feet. Now we must shape the paths beyond our sight. The seventh phase would require something unprecedented, proactive expansion. Messengers traveled farther than ever before, 2-3 days, journey in each direction. Not warnings this time, but proposals. Shared stewardship of wells. Rotational caravan hosting among allied settlements. Joint oversight of passes before outside investors consolidated ownership. Some villages hesitated. Cooperation in defense was one thing, cooperation in resource governance was another. Autonomy had deep roots, but the memory of failed raids lingered fresh. Isolation had nearly cost them everything once before. The first breakthrough came at the northern pass, where rumors of land acquisition had surfaced. 3 settlements bordering the narrow valley agreed to establish a cooperative watch, not armed fortification.